Deep in a locked wing of a Wainwright manor, behind a rusted cabinet and a stack of probate ledgers, lay a leather-bound dossier smelling of lavender and damp paper. For decades, the Wainwright archive was treated like a wound, sealed by trustees referenced in hush-tone conversations at dinner, and miscatalogued beneath indifferent shelf numbers that obscured its contents. When a junior archivist finally forced open the iron trunk in 1952, she found letters, ledgers, journals, and a series of intimate confessions written in 3 different hands. What she read did not announce itself politely. The pages unfolded like a map of descent, domestic inventories, charitable bequests, formal correspondence. Then a tilt into private language, requests framed as devotion, entries scrawled with apologies, promises that read like contracts. The family had long performed public piety, endowments to the parish, a wing at the infirmary, portraits hung in town halls that sat stern and respectable. Behind that face of beneficence, the documents revealed regimented solitude, a household organized around control and measured hospitality, a pattern in which guests were ushered into curated rooms and certain conversations were simply not had. The narration that follows is drawn from those papers and from interviews with clergy, housekeepers, and descendants who were taught to fold silence into civility. This is not voyeurism. It is a careful unearthing, an attempt to read how a house, a ledger, and a father's authority could conspire to remap the boundaries between care and claim. If you want to follow this unspooling, subscribe and remain with us as we walk these rooms. And if you will, let the house know where you listen from. Drop your town or country in the comments so that this confession travels beyond locked trunks and trustees. And now, before the shutters close again and old paper returns to its sleep, perform an act of witness type. The veil is broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. The first documents describe Sir Alistair Wainwright, philanthropist, magistrate, a man whose public life was precise and whose private measures are written in margins that grow darker as the ledger continues. He married Marianne Hale and installed within the household a regimen of lessons, devotions, and an exact order where obedience was taught and questions were quietly punished. The daughters, Evelyn, Clara, Josephine, received polish and instruction, instruments of refinement that would later be repurposed into tools of survival. In the ledger, the slow pivot from guardianship to possession can be traced like a fault line, waiting for pressure to shift. The Wainwright archive opens with the ordinary details of lineage, land deeds, a ledger of gifts to parish and college, portraits commissioned in sober tones. Sir Alistair Wainwright appears in the account as a man of exact habits, morning prayers at 8, lectures attended in London, donations allocated each quarter to the Guild. He married Marianne Hale, a woman of piety and cultivated gardens, whose letters praised charity and moderation, and whose lace collars were noted for their neat hems. The daughters were reared beneath crystal chandeliers and hymn books, schooled in languages and deportment so they might move through salons and parish rooms with ease. Evelyn learned piano and shorthand, Clara excelled in needlework and the rituals of civility, Josephine drew birds and practiced the precise smile that would please a gentleman at a reception. The journal records small domestic rites, morning prayers read aloud by candle, the exact portion of porridge deemed proper for daughters, attendance of the household chaplain. And it is in the margins that the first small tremors appear: a watched laugh, a footfall noted longer than usual, a notation of lingering at the foot of stairs. Those marginal comments, at first barely legible, are the first fissures in an otherwise tidy ledger. Local recollections praise the family's patronage, donations to the schoolroom, memorial windows in the church, while the household records show increasing rituals of management. Visitors led to private rooms, doors locked after certain hours, and a pattern of hospitality that previously seemed generous becoming alarmingly exclusive. The entries, when read together, reveal the early mechanics of containment: the daughters trained to please, the household rehearsed to conceal, a public face polished until it functioned as a mask. The ledger's ordinary line items thus read like preparations: furniture moved, wardrobes catalogued, keys exchanged. In a house that measured virtue in donations and deeded acreage, the ledger quietly records what the family could afford to hide and how they planned to hide it. Marianne's illness arrives in the diaries like a slow erosion, Fever words that narrow to single, urgent notes code, breathless Lenin. The household responds with protocol, physicians called, the will consulted, wardrobes inventoried, grief performed publicly, managed privately. In the ledger her death is recorded with the same clinical neatness as an estate transfer, a notation, a date, a seal. Yet the marginalia reveal a different interior. Sir Alistair arranging Marianne's ribbons at the dressing table, speaking into empty rooms, as if to an audience that would not answer. He maintains his public composure while, in private, reconfiguring the household to preserve her presence in objects rather than people. Beds shift, chairs are relocated to face rooms where Marianne once sat, and feminine articles are placed on display in the main parlor. The ledger's careful hands pivot routines once distributed are centralized around an absence. What reads as grief is also, in time, revealed as strategy, possession of a memory reconstituted into authority. The daughters inherit not only skills but obligation, and the house's governance becomes wrapped in the language of duty. Evelyn writes that her father vows never to remarry because she is still the heart of this house, yet his actions begin to prescribe the daughter's comportment. Who sits where, how a dress must be folded, how a response to a visitor should be framed. The journal's tone shifts from education to instruction, and what might have been care becomes a matrix for surveillance. Isolation, once mitigated by social visits and market days, deepens in winter months. Trustees praise the family's fortitude while interior entries record daily acts of contingency and a mounting insistence that public reputation must outlast private fracture. In this slow contraction, the household reorganizes itself until the daughters become both custodians of the dead wife's likeness and subjects to an increasingly claustrophobic domestic order. In time, the margins become letters that masquerade as devotion, petitions to scripture that tip toward the personal. A ledger entry notes a council evening where Sir Alistair invited Evelyn into the morning room to discuss duty and comfort, phrasing that initially reads like filial concern and then, in context, grows heavy. Housekeeper's right of overheard parlance in which the father's voice thins into intimacies that are not paternal. They record moments when a correction for a curt reply becomes disproportionate. An elderly maid, interviewed much later, speaks of evenings where the daughters were asked to read aloud from devotional texts, while the father listened from shadow, his presence compressing scripture into something that functioned more like command than counsel. The girls' journals, once filled with music and grammar, begin to list favors and obligations, small debts that matured into iron vows. Here the ledger shows an operation of rhetoric, sorrow turned into entitlement, duty reshaped into claim, and language doctored to convert care into ownership. Medical notes recommend rest and tonics, lawyers advise discretion, clergy recommend patience, an institutional chorus that softens alarm and normalizes secrecy. The documents couch transgression in propriety, but that careful diction itself becomes a sign of calculation. Readers must recognize the pattern. Those who control the language around an act are often the ones who control its witness. To acknowledge what you are hearing, and to bind yourself to the act of seeing, perform this simple witness now. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. This is not theatricality but a ritual of attention, a small, public recognition that moves the story from private trunk to collective memory. Without that shared recognition, the ledger's euphemisms can do their work unchecked. After that point, the daughters' notebooks change texture, handwriting trembles, sentences fragment, as if each writer met herself only in outline. Evelyn's pages take on the air of a moral ledger, scheduled appointments recorded alongside small notations. Tea with the vicar, an evening of scripture to steadied nerves, and a column titled "For Peace," where currency and favors are tallied. Clara's embroidery patterns carry margins annotated in another hand, small numbers, times, repetitions that read like ritual tallies. Josephine's drawings become architectural, floor plans with doors emphasized and rotes shaded, sketches that read as exercises in escape and as maps of entrapment. Each daughter circles in ink or pencil, a single recurring silhouette, a chair angled not toward the fire but toward them, a chair that mediates attention and claim. These private artifacts do not simply record what was done to them, they show how the daughters learned to translate coercion into utility, How fear was organized into lists and calendars in order to coexist. The psychology that emerges across pages is devastating because it reveals adaptation, fragile humans trading portions of themselves to preserve a thread of safety. At moments they compress rebellion into coded phrases. The river took the time. Signals hidden in mundane logs so that a future reader might detect dissent where none could safely be declared. Among the papers are correspondences between chaplains and solicitors, a network that normalized secrecy under the banner of counsel. Respectability's machinery smooths the edges of abuse and buries testimony beneath polite cross-references. Reading these pages is to witness the slow engineering of consent, a process made efficient by deference, law, and the routines of civility. The surrounding counties celebrated the Wainwrights as pillar patrons, donors to the schoolhouse, benefactors at harvest festivals, steady givers to the parish. But local memory preserves evasions. Visitors were counseled to avoid certain wings, invitations extended with caveats, and families politely instructed not to pry. Servants' notes, transcribed in later testimonies, describe nights of candles, moving behind closed doors, repairs made to wardrobes explained away as maintenance, and an odd economy of favors exchanged to maintain a facade. An obscure parish ledger mentions payments to a specialist in nervous complaints, who visited twice and departed with padded invoices, and a warning not to publish his observations. Clergymen who corresponded with house authorities often requested discretion, a phrase that both protected those in power and erased the vulnerable. Influence, money, and obligation created a thick silence. The household's reputational capital functioned like a membrane that resisted scrutiny. The daughters, outwardly presented as genteel, were offered the social stage without autonomy. The eldest had an engagement announced and then quietly withdrawn. The middle sister entertained musical evenings that never led to marriage. The youngest was encouraged into private study rather than public life. These public adjustments were later explained as fragility or unsuitable county life, phrases that served to obscure a more precise mechanism of control. Through patronage and social ties, the family converted scandal into a set of arrangements that looked like prudence. What the ledger captures is not merely a household's decline, but a system of social engineering where the veneer of charity conceals a complex structure of containment. Midway through the ledger, a cluster of letters appears in a hand that grows fevered with rationalization. Sir Alistair composes missives that blend scripture and estate law, phrases insisting daughters are entrusted guardians of household harmony and therefore subject to paternal stewardship. He cites Marianne's supposed wishes, claiming the mother willed closeness as duty and framed sacrifice as familial piety. Legal annotations beside those letters sometimes note unusual phrasing or see-will clause, hints that council and household were in quiet consultation. The rhetoric is meticulous, affection repurposed as duty, desire named civic necessity, an operation of language designed to anesthetize moral sense. These documents reveal how institutions, lawyers, clergy, physicians can be marshaled to blur boundaries when faced with wealth and influence. Annotations show how formalities of consent were constructed, signatures requested, receipts recorded, phrases placed to manufacture evidentiary backing. The archive preserves not only what was done, but how those in power built a scaffolding of plausibility around transgression. Where scandal threatened, it was rewritten as piety. Where force might have been acknowledged, it was rebranded as consolation. The ledger's middle pages thus function as a manual of contamination, how ethical language is hollowed to justify possession, and how bureaucracy can become an engine of forgetting. As the narrative tightens, a winter is described in merciless detail, shutters drawn, cold dwindling, a calendar of midnight vigils that align with the father's pacing. A servant recalls Sir Alistair walking the hall at 2 a.m. with a lantern, checking doors as if verifying a flock, making note of who had slept where and for how long. The daughter's prose grows elliptical, certain words become unsayable and are replaced by pale euphemisms. Josephine confesses a private practice, drawing each room 3 times from different angles in the hope that repetition might reveal a door missed by fear. A solicitor from another county writes, in a letter lodged among the papers, urging prudence and caution. The reply suggests patience, a plea to preserve reputation over rupture. The ledger at this point shows how patience becomes complicit, delaying investigation, discouraging witnesses, recasting transgression as a family matter. And again we ask for a small, solemn witness from you, the listener type. The veil is broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. This ritual is not a plea for spectacle but a binding acknowledgement, a way to ensure that private language enters public record. The slow aggregation of such acknowledgements historically uproots systems designed to forget. Public recognition is a first tool against institutional amnesia. In the middle pages, the daughters' voices shift toward clinical registry. They begin cataloging their reactions as if specimens pinned to paper. Evelyn notes sleeplessness, appetite loss, and dissociative spells. Clara maps the way light on a stair makes her feel observed, an embodied symptom attached to rooms rather than events. Medical notes, sparse though they are, prescribe rest cures, tonics, travel for sea air, a summer spent with relatives, remedies that placate without addressing root cause. The household's containment is systematic, physicians called to nod knowingly, servants reassigned to monitor comings and goings, heavier curtains hung to muffle the world outside. These interventions read like bandages over a deeper wound. They obscure rather than excise what has taken root. The girls' notebooks record a language of survival, practiced phrases to say when guests arrive, rehearsed smiles, hand signals concealed beneath gloves to warn each other of a corridor to avoid. A list of permitted visitors appears in estate files, a roll called like a parole docket, names crossed and uncrossed at the father's discretion. With each crossed name, the sister's world narrows. Agency is measured by appointments rather than choices. The ledger thus records how trauma manufactures protocols of self-protection, rules destined to conserve life at the expense of full freedom. Here the archive reads like a clinical file of adaptation, and those pages are an early lesson in how power rewires the vulnerable. Outside the house, the county press records gossip in euphemisms, withdrawn from society, and delicate health, phrases designed to explain absence without naming harm. Suitors who approached with intent found their correspondence redirected, their visits scheduled in ways that made privacy impossible or deliberately awkward. One merchant recounted arriving by appointment to find an additional table set in a side room and conversation deliberately engineered to quash intimacy. Rumors, later corroborated by ledger entries, suggest quiet payments made to encourage silence from other families and keep alliances pliant. The daughters' suitors were assessed not merely for character but for vulnerability. Would a young man be pliable, indebted, fearful of contravening a local magistrate? Such calculations expose the mechanics of social control, influence, and money used to neutralize rescue before it begins. The archives show a pattern of thwarted relationships, letters misplaced, introductions delayed, reputations shaded with convenient doubts. Once, when Evelyn approached a plausible reprieve in the form of an engagement, a sudden health reversal and an unexpected recall of the match are noted in the ledger. For each thwarted courtship, a small industry of persuasion and pressure is documented. Cash flows, discreet loans, veiled threats, so that escape, when attempted, met prearranged barriers. The story here is not of a single villainous act, but of a social architecture designed to make leaving unbearable. The papers do not indulge in lurid description. They present instead the slow arithmetic of compromise. Appointments, permissions, consolations described in bureaucratic language. The father's correspondences adopt euphemisms: consolation, a comfort in bereavement, arrangements of solace. Terms that sanitize and authorize what, in reality, was coercive. The daughters appear in records as recipients of care, parcels accepted, sums accounted for, receipts signed for clothing and sustenance. It is crucial to pass these documents without sensationalism. The ledger shows how consent was manufactured through economic pressure and spiritual rebuke. Signatures and acknowledgements become evidentiary buffers that paper over the absence of true voluntariness. Diaries, however, reveal the other ledger: a trembling hand forced to write, a short line penned to mimic autonomy while the heart recoiled. Attempts later to litigate faced a wall of documentation shaped by wealth and deference. The law itself had been enlisted as an instrument of silence. The Wainwright papers therefore demonstrate a painful lesson. Abuse often hides not in spectacle, but in procedures that appear ordinary. Receipts, letters, signed notes, that when assembled create a plausible narrative of consent. The archive records are how to for institutional obfuscation, where paperwork is turned into protection and paper trails morph into weapons. Attempts at escape appear in the margins like furtive footnotes, a planned coach ride scratched out at the last minute, a name circled then struck, a key imagined under a loose floorboard, and then left where fear made hands tremble. Josephine drew a doorway she intended to push open, and then crossed it out when courage faltered. Evelyn recounts a night she crept toward the stables with a valise, only to be intercepted by a servant quietly instructed to tidy the yard, an arrangement that returned her to bed without a scene. Each flight plan seems anticipated and countered. The father's social network, both overt and clandestine, expected routes and closed them. The sisters learned that escape required allies beyond the household, allies not under the family's thumb. In the absence of reliable external help, their resistance took the form of coded rebellion, letters delivered to neighbors with ambiguous lines hinting at distress, a stitch in a hem hiding a list of names, a garden gate left unlatched in hope that a friend might notice. These ephemeral acts were lifelines, means to keep hope in ink so it might be found if rescue ever arrived. The archives preserve them like small treasures, faint signals that the daughters kept constructing exits, even when their feet could not follow. Those hidden attempts reveal a crucial truth about endurance. Victims often spend great energy rehearsing escape before they physically flee, and those rehearsals leave traces that later historians can follow. The ledger's central horror is cumulative rather than singular. It is a crescendo of small betrayals that, over seasons, turn into catastrophe. One winter evening is reduced in the entries to a few precise notations: Gust bidden to sit for discourse, daughters to sing, supper delayed, fire high, father insistent. A subsequent line reads, Evelyn found in breach of duty, a bureaucratic phrase that, when decoded, marks an event which altered the family's course. That breach appears to have involved a servant threatening exposure and being quietly dismissed after receiving a small payout. A maid's later letter indicates she was relocated under a new name and told to keep silence. After that incident, the sisters adopt new precautions. Double doors locked earlier, curtains drawn, songs sung with altered verses that avoid memory rather than preserve it. There are entries recording men arriving with solicitors' briefcases, conversations held behind closed shutters, and payments scribbled into margins described as for peace of mind. The crescendo is a reminder that grave violations rarely erupt from nowhere. They are produced by a long process of erosion and normalization. The ledger compresses years of harm into terse administrative language, and the human cost becomes an itemized list. Time lost, youth surrendered, trust fragmented. Reading this cluster of pages is an exercise in assembling a life punctuated by routine coercion, and the effect is cumulative, small violences that, together, construct a life of constrained choices. In the aftermath, the daughters become deft practitioners of survival, learning to perform public ease while keeping private notebooks as contraband. Clara composes lists of acceptable responses, phrases to deflect inquiries and preserve household continuity without revealing fracture. Evelyn adopts language as armor, rehearsing answers that placate neighbors while hiding the tremor beneath her cadence. Josephine turns to drawing as testimony, rendering faces, rooms, and the way light falls across a man's hands when they reach for a touch that should never be. Remaining servants speak in guarded terms. Their accounts are filtered through loyalty and fear, yet some kept scrapbooks of receipts and notes that later proved vital to the archivist piecing together events. Public life continues. Plaques unveiled, donations acknowledged, portraits maintained. These acts of civic virtue stand in grotesque contrast to the ledger's persistent entries of claim. The daughters, stripped of private recourse, learn to become archivists of themselves, cataloging injuries as lists they could carry like armor. These practices are at once survival and testimony, small, private acts meant to preserve identity when public structures deny protection. In the quiet of parlor and parsonage, they make codes and marks that only they might understand, faint traces subjected to later discovery by historians who would read courage between the lines. Later attempts to seek legal remedy met the habitual barriers of deference and discretion. A solicitor's note records witnesses as reluctant, and mentioned servants who had passed away or moved beyond reach, phrases that thread absence into evidence of disappearance rather than consequence. Financial settlements arrive in hushed rooms, agreements drafted bearing non-disclosure clauses intended to bury grievance under contract. The family opted for quiet resolutions that protected titles and reputations, exchanging silence for modest pensions to those who might otherwise testify. Even when a coroner's remarks hinted at impropriety, civic leaders weighed the costs, reputational harm versus public benefit provided by the Wainwrights' philanthropy. This is the grim arithmetic of power. Public good used as currency to buy privacy and to silence vulnerability. The ledger documents these transactions like entries in a bank book. Margins hold cancelled checks and shorthand notes about compassionate disbursements. Often the practical outcome ensured memory privatized. Survivors left with personal reckonings unpaid by the institutions that might have held wrongdoers to account. The result is a legal landscape where apology and payment substitute for full accountability, and where documentation serves to rationalize rather than to rectify. When the archivist who had first opened the trunk published excerpted notes, trustees moved swiftly to classify some materials as sensitive. Researchers requesting access were told portions of the collection contained private family matters inappropriate for public dissemination. Some pages were withdrawn from the reading room. Fragments leaked to scholars and journalists who assembled chronologies, each new discovery sharpening the outline of abuse. Those historians argued that the case was not mere familial scandal, but an institutional failure, an instructive example of how social capital, clerical deference, and legal craft can conspire to conceal harm. The archive, once a repository, became a contested site where truth, memory, and power collided. Public debate followed. Should such papers remain sealed to protect living descendants, or should they be open to survivors and scholars seeking to understand pattern and precedent? Each decision about access was, in effect, a moral act, either extending a silence or beginning to fracture it. The archivist's notebook reveals anxiety about the consequences of exposure, the risk of re-traumatizing families weighed against the duty to document. The tension between privacy and public good would shape how the Wainwright story entered historical consciousness, and the choices made in reading rooms became part of the story itself. The Wainwright story teaches a broader lesson about institutions' social capital can create a protective membrane that resists scrutiny. Clergy counseling the family often prioritized reputational management over pastoral truth. Medical practitioners offered remedies treating symptoms while leaving causes untouched. Legal counsel drafted documents furnishing plausible deniability, while household staff, economically dependent, were incentivized to preserve the status quo. This complex of actors demonstrates how multiple institutions can act in concert to preserve a lie. Historians studying such cases note repeating patterns: wealth delays justice, ritual disguises exploitation, and the obligations of civility are repurposed into tools of containment. The ledger thus functions as both record and manual, showing not only the harm but also the mechanics of concealment. Where community deference intersects with institutional self-interest, truth often becomes negotiable. The Wainwright papers remain, therefore, an instruction in how reputations can be weaponized to hide wrongdoing, and in how official forms, receipts, affidavits, charitable plaques, can be enlisted to create a veneer that obscures human cost. In later life, the surviving sisters fashioned small existences of remarkable restraint. Evelyn devoted herself to cloistered philanthropy. Clara taught embroidery to neighborhood children. Josephine donated sketches anonymously to local libraries. They lived within the bounds assigned to them, founding private charities and leaving bequests that later complicated moral appraisal of their lives. When descendants were asked about family history, they spoke of tragedy and stoicism rather than accusation, choosing words like sadness and misunderstanding over naming harm. Yet psychological traces remained: records of insomnia, mistrust of physicians, and enduring reluctance toward intimacy carried into subsequent generations. Modern therapists studying the case files diagnosed symptoms consistent with complex trauma dissociation, reenactment of harm, and internalized responsibility for another's actions. The living aftermath demonstrates how abuse ripples across time, shaping not only direct victims but the architecture of family memory. Those effects complicate tidy moral narratives. Survivors can become patrons, benefactors, carriers of both dignity and suppressed pain, and their gestures to community can both heal and further conceal. The ledger ultimately chronicles not just cruelty, but a legacy of coping and quiet resistance. The archivist's private notes reveal anxiety over what to publish and what to withhold. She feared re-traumatizing living relatives while feeling duty, bound to illuminate patterns of abuse. Her journals detail meetings with trustees, lawyers, and scholars, and a slow, meticulous selection of items that might educate without annihilating. That curatorial choice shaped how the Wainwright narrative entered the public sphere, part exposed, part sealed, a story curated to instruct without destroying. Some historians criticized the partial release, arguing that fragmentary truth can breed myths as dangerous as silence. Others defended the archivist, pointing to fragile lives tethered to those pages and the risk of sensationalization. The ethical tensions of curation remind us that history is rarely neutral and that stewardship of archives is itself a moral act. Decisions about access are decisions about justice and memory, who is protected, who is revealed, and how we balance truth, telling with care. The contested archive thus stands as a testament to an uneasy compromise between revealing harm and preserving the living. In the end, what is shown and what remains sequestered both shape public understanding, and the choices made by those who guard the papers become part of the story told. In the dossier's final available pages, the handwriting fades and ink blurs as if tears had washed the script. There is no tidy closure, only a concatenation of quiet settlements, amended wills, changed trustees, and silent retirements that never fully account for harm. The Wainwright heiresses did not become myth or martyr. They became complex survivors whose lives were stitched with secrecy and small acts of resistance. Our duty in telling this is to refuse the soft complicity polite society often prefers, the smoothing over of horror with the balm of charity. This account is offered not for prurient interest, but to study the mechanics of concealment and to hold a mirror to institutions that too often choose reputation over repair. If you have listened this far, consider the ledger you inherit in your own community, which names are protected by plaques and donations, which complaints are postponed in favor of patronage, which wreaths obscure private harm. Speak where you can, support survivors, and press for archives to be handled as repositories of truth rather than instruments of preservation for the privileged. History, used honestly, can be a tool of liberation. If we use it to recognize patterns, to name wrongdoing, and to demand systems that prioritize accountability over the preservation of prestige. Keep this story with you, and let recognition, not silence, be the measure of our response.